Greetings. My name is John Murray. I'm the pastor here at First Baptist Church in Hawthorne, Nevada. Glad to have you with us today. We're going to be looking at the book of Philippians, a little bit of the book of Philippians this morning, out of chapter 1. And here in the book of Philippians, we find that Paul is in prison. Philippians is one of the 4 prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, books that Paul wrote while he was imprisoned, hence the name prison epistles. You would think that that would be a big deal for Paul, that he would focus on that would be the point that he faces and wrestles with daily. And here in the book of Philippians, in chapter 1, verse 19, Paul says, "For I know that your prayers, I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance." Great, Paul's going to get out of prison, except that's not what he's talking about here. He says in verse 20, "As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage now as always Christ will be honored in my body." Still, really good news. "Whether by life or by death." So Paul isn't saying, well, I'm just stuck here in prison for a little while and I hope things turn out and I anticipate getting out soon. He doesn't know that. He goes on to say, and here's a very famous verse, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." He goes on a couple verses later. He said, "I am hard pressed between the two, between life and death. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your account." Again, from my way of thinking, that would be Paul's daily meditation. This would be in his thoughts every single moment. And probably in the thoughts of the Philippian believers as they think of him. But what we're going to find here is that was not Paul's real focus. And Paul encourages the Philippians to think differently as well. And here in this little section we're going to be looking at, we find that we ought to live worthy of the gospel. We recognize that we have sinned, and the wages of sin is death. There is punishment for our sin. The good news is that Jesus Christ came to earth, died, and paid the penalty for our sins, and then offers that salvation to us as a free gift. That's great news. So what does it mean to live worthy of the gospel, of that gospel? Even in times like Paul, where he is in fear for his life. Now, we're not in prison, although it sometimes feels like that with all of the stay in place and in Nevada we're talking about staying here for probably a little while longer. We aren't really in prison, though. We have the ability to talk with one another. We have the ability to see one another in very small groups. We can go to the grocery store. We can get out and hike and exercise and things like that. But here Paul is talking about, what does it mean to walk worthy of the gospel? Well, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 27, he says, "Only let your manner of life, the way that you live, be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or in absence," whether I live or die, if I happen to live and come and see you, or whether I die here in prison or from execution, "that I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel." We have to walk or live worthy of the gospel here by standing united. Paul says that you stand firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. About a year ago, we worked through the book of First Corinthians, and one of the interesting points as we got through that book is that Paul regularly comes back to the idea of unity. Now, they weren't throwing rocks at each other, but there was just this undercurrent of unease, separation. We go to church, but we don't necessarily talk. We're together, but it's only surface. We are not really one body at that point. And Paul says we need to be. We must be. In fact, he uses 3 different phrases to say that idea. We must work side by side. But I don't that doesn't matter. We must strive side by side, not because I enjoy it or because it pleases me, but for the gospel, for the faith of the gospel. That trumps everything. That trumps Paul being in prison. That trumps hardship. That trumps difficult times. That trumps the idea of facing death. This idea of unity trumps everything. And so we need to stand united. And I've heard great stories from many of you, how that you're talking with one another and doing Facebook Live, or I don't know that anybody's doing Zoom here, but we are having those little contacts with one another. Keep that up. We may be separated by distance, but technology can bring us together. One of the great things Paul probably wishes that he was able to use back in his day. Going on, looking at verse 28, Paul says, "And not be frightened in anything by your opponents." In Paul's case, the situation was his opponents were physical people, the Judaizers, the Roman government. These were the people that were standing against him. Today we have an opponent that, frankly, we can't see without a microscope. We have a coronavirus. But whatever it is, Paul would aggressively have said, you don't have to be afraid. Not frightened in anything. Whether it's lions in a coliseum or whether it's a virus that we don't even know if it's there or not. Paul says we don't have to be frightened of anything. How come? Well, go back to what he said earlier. If I stay here, it's good for you. If I go home, it's good for me. And those are the 2 options. And Paul said, we don't have to be frightened of that. We don't look forward to the process of moving from this life to the next, but we don't have to be afraid of where we're going. We don't have to be worried about the unknown. In our case, the unknown is going to be a very, very pleasant surprise as we go home. He goes on to say, "This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God." So the people around Paul, and we find that Paul was able to minister even to his Roman guards that were standing there chained to him all day long. Why aren't you afraid? Why aren't you fussed? Why aren't you angry? And Paul says, this is what God has for me now. Aren't you afraid? You may die. Paul says, man, that'd be great. I get to go home. This had to affect the guards. This had to affect those around Paul. This had to affect those that would want to throw rocks at Paul. And he said, this is a clear sign of their destruction. They don't have that hope that we have. They don't have that confidence. They don't. Their faith is not in Jesus Christ and his payment for the penalty of our sins on the cross. Their trust isn't in that. Their trust is, I've got a plan. Their trust is, I'm following a leader. Their trust is people or themselves, worse yet. And Paul says that makes you afraid because those things aren't trustworthy. He says, but of your salvation, this is a clear sign of your salvation, and that from God. I I came to Christ a long time ago, 40 some years ago now, and that has changed my life. How do you know? Because as I go through this time, I'm not afraid. And it's not because I'm smart, it's not because I'm rich, it's not because I'm strong. It's because I've received salvation from God. From God. Not myself, from God. And Paul says, these are ways in which we can live out the gospel, when we can live worthy of the gospel. By standing united, by living fearlessly, and then lastly here, seeing clearly what we ought to do. Don't be afraid. Stand strong. Keep going. Trust God. I hope this is a little bit of an encouragement to you as we go through this coronavirus time. It looks like we're beginning to see the end approaching, and we'll see how things go over the next couple of weeks. Pray for those that have been diagnosed here in Hawthorne with coronavirus. There are 4 so far, at least at the time I do this video. People are afraid, and rightly so, because they don't have the confidence and the hope that we have. And pray for one another, other believers. Stay in touch with one another. Give somebody a phone call today, and just say hi and say, hey, I'm thinking about you. I've been doing that regularly all along here, and it's a good thing.